Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals and what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earl. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsearl.com. In today's interview, I interviewed Dr. Nancy Morgan. Nancy is an Oregon-licensed clinical psychologist and is also a licensed professional counselor in California and Colorado. She provides introduction to IFS training to therapists and educators, and introduction to psychedelics training and consultation for IFS-trained therapists and practitioners interested in learning about psychedelic-assisted therapies and research. Nancy is a certified IFS therapist and IFS consultant, and she has assisted over a dozen IFS trainings since 2018. Nancy received her certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapies and research from the California Institute of Integral Studies. She has a private practice in Ashland, Oregon, and will be providing psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy following the completion of her Oregon training in early 2023. You can learn more on our website, which I'll link in the show notes, and I hope you enjoy this interview. I also want to mention I'm feeling a little bit sick when I recorded this interview, and so you may hear some coughs, but I don't think it'll be all that distracting. And thanks again for listening to this podcast and giving us ratings and reviews. It really helps us get out in front of people and bring more messages of healing and hope to therapists and people who are interested in therapy. So here's the interview. All right. Dr. Morgan, thanks for being on the podcast today. I really appreciate it. The first question I often like to pose to guests is, how do you view change? What does it take for an individual to change? What does it take for a system to change?
I appreciate that question. First thing is, I see individuals as part of a system. I see everything as systemic. In inner systems, outer systems, everything is relational, everything is connected. So in order to have change, it feels to me like change is an adaptation either to something that's happening to us that then we are needing to respond to because it's not part of what we're already used to, that our system isn't used to. So there's a natural adaptation. So that's more of a reactive response to some sort of other external stimuli, or possibly internal. Or there's the awareness and desire to shift things from where they are to maybe a more ideal outcome, an ideal potential. And so then it's a conscious effort to look at what will it take to make the change, and how and what steps are needed, and then looking for the right scaffolding to help so that as the intention to change is present, the system can respond and move in concert with that intention.
Well, and be curious if you could speak a bit more about that scaffolding for people who are interested in changing. Is there like kind of a framework for that scaffolding? Is it unique to each person given the unique change that they want to make?
I would say because we're all so unique, it's unique to each person, and there are some common themes. So we can take therapy. So oftentimes, I think my experience is the majority of the times people have come to therapy, it's because they're suffering, something's hurting, and they really want to get out of the hurt, but they don't know how, and they've tried every way that they could.
Yeah.
So I think then what they're leaning into is that maybe therapy will provide the scaffolding, that they can come to the therapist and there will be some sort of support that will be provided, ideally in a safe container, some structure that they can then rely on and that the therapist can help provide some of the guiding relative to how to utilize that scaffolding. So maybe it's a therapeutic approach. Maybe for some couples, maybe it would be emotion focused therapy, or the Gottman approach. There, for individuals, it could be any number of therapeutic approaches. My personal approach is internal family systems. And so when people seek me out, they're looking for what I can offer in the context of what they've come to identify with internal family systems therapy if they've heard about it or read about it. So that's the scaffolding that I would provide them.
Yeah, and I love that metaphor of scaffolding. Michael White, narrative therapy, he presented that metaphor in his work, but I love that, no matter what model, that's what people are looking for, is some scaffolding, because they've been doing the best they can to heal, and they just keep on coming up against that same barrier. There's that stuckness, or else they wouldn't be seeking a therapist, right?
Right.
And yeah, I think that's really well put. I know you've done a lot of work around bringing IFS into graduate programs. I graduated about a year ago from a university, and there definitely was not much education with IFS, and I think it is personally such a brilliant model that really gets to the core, the center of what's bringing in people to therapy, and I think it does such a wonderful job at equipping people to heal themselves, and giving them the tools they need to continue the healing process outside of the therapy room, which just, part of the reason it resonates so much for me. In my graduate program, one of my peers, she was really into IFS, and I was in a marriage and family therapy program, the systems paradigm, but viewing more within the context of relational systems, not internal systems. In our field, was a response to that intrapsychic, psychoanalytic paradigm. And, that she was, I think, the only person I ever heard talk about IFS, and she got a bit of flack for it. Actually, some professors said, it's not really a systems model. Can you make a case for the field around why it is so important for a marriage and family therapy program, or any program that teaches people how to counsel, to incorporate IFS concepts?
Yes. It's a big question, and
Yeah.
I might need your help here to keep me in my lane, because I
I'll
could
do my
go.
best.
The first thing I want to say is that some years ago in Anaheim, I attended the 4-day, I think, maybe 5-day Evolution of Psychotherapy conference. Huge, with so many top names. And Richard Dick Schwartz, the developer of IFS, wasn't there. And I thought, how can he not be here when this is one of the fastest growing therapeutic models, not just in the US, but the world? And that it's even beyond therapy. Some people consider it a lifestyle. Some people even look at it as a spiritual practice, or all of the above. And so I asked him about it, and he said, well, they've never invited me. And then the subsequent Evolution of Psychotherapy conference I saw advertised, and still he hadn't been invited. And I thought a lot about that, and I thought, why would you not invite somebody? This is an identified evidence-based model. It stands on its own. There's incredible research being done right now, especially in the world of trauma, that's incorporating IFS. And so as I really considered why they wouldn't be there, one of the things that I realized is it is a new paradigm. It is a real new paradigm that first of all envisions that we are all a multiplicity. And any one of us knows that at different points in our lives, we've said, a part of me really feels this way, but I have another part that really I can't. Or, I feel that if I could do this, it would be great, but something's holding me back. And we know we already talk like that. And so the thing that IFS adds is it recognizes that that is not a disorder, but this is a real representation of the true dynamics that have always been there in our systems. But add to that the awareness that we are not only composed of those parts of us, we are also composed or comprised of a self. And that's where IFS is completely different. And the self is the essence of who we are. And the essence, those qualities will include a certain calm, connection, compassion, creativity, clarity. They're identified sometimes as the 8 C's. And Dick has said that he likes alliteration. It's one of the ways to help remember certain elements or qualities. And but that they aren't limited. There's also sort of awe and wonder and presence, perspective, patience. They're basically the qualities we identify when we are in our fullest, most realized, most present place, and we feel it. Well, what he discovered then is working with people who are highly traumatized, and saying, "Well, let's find out what that part's role is in your system, and how about that one?" And once he got to know and hear and help he was curious about the parts rather than pathologizing. Then people got to a certain place where he would say, "Okay, now what's this part of you now that we've learned about the others?" And people would say, "Well, that's not a part. That's just me. That's who I am." And so he started calling that the capital S self. And that self, no matter what has happened in a person's life, can never be damaged. It's sort of like when clouds come in front of the sun, it doesn't damage the sun, it just obscures its radiance, and that's how parts can obscure the radiance of the self, and not all parts of us are doing that. Some parts of us are functioning really well, but other parts developed out of early wounds that we had when we really needed someone else to be there for us in a way that would help us respond to whatever was happening that was beyond our capacity to respond. But if that person wasn't there, or they were there, but they weren't there in the way we needed, or maybe that person was even the one hurting us, which really creates confusion. And that's what a lot of our attachment theory looks at. Without that, then our systems naturally develop their own response, their own protective response, just like scar tissue would if we cut ourselves. And so those parts that develop those responses, that protective response, recognizing, well, if no one's here, I got to take care of myself, even though you're a little kid. When that happens, those parts are considered burdened. And that's the work of IFS, is to call upon the inner healing intelligence of the self to be present in a way that allows for a deeper understanding and connection of those burdened parts of us. So maybe I'll just stop there because that's kind of an overview of IFS, but you can see right there how different it is. Because the therapist, as a therapist at doing IFS, I facilitate. If you were my client, I'd facilitate your inner healing intelligence connecting to those parts of you that were burdened and the parts they were protecting, those tender, vulnerable parts of you. And you'd get to know and be present with and be part of a healing process that is yours. It's not up to me to be clever. It's not up to me to fix anything. It's my role to create a supportive structure that facilitates your healing. So that would, in essence, shift the approach of pretty much everybody, but Jean Houston, for example, because she was there at the conference when I was there. But it would shift the whole premise of the therapeutic model as we learned it in graduate school. And as it appears in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which sees people still as disordered rather than adaptive and pathologizes. IFS does not pathologize.
Dr. Morgan, there's so much there that just you shared that filled me with excitement. And as you're talking about that, this concept of self, and I just see you embodying that right now. And my experience with you and with other people in my life, you know, who not, some of whom haven't even followed IFS, but do embody that presence. I think IFS has just given me a way to conceptualize that presence.
Right.
My system can
Right.
relax, and then
Right.
it allows me, as you know, a friend, a colleague, to be more creative, to
Mhm.
bring more of myself out, in the relationship, and in my other relationships, and for myself. So um, it makes complete. Thank you for giving that overview of IFS, and you really stayed focused on, I think, the heart of IFS as I understand it. I'm newer to the model, but
Mhm.
and then yeah, that demonstrates the importance of this paradigm
Mhm.
being taught in graduate programs.
That would be my hope. So that gets back to part of your question too, um, which for me, in May of 2015, I'd been directing. I was a new director for a 46-week practicum training program out of Northern California's largest agency dedicated to breaking the cycle of homelessness. The
Wow.
agency is Life Moves. And um, and so I was newly hired to be the director of their training program. And I was going to bring in 20 plus years of Vajrayana Buddhist practice, and it was going to be kind of a mindfulness based, trauma focused graduate training practicum for 5 Bay Area graduate schools. And at that time, it was all just the doctoral students. It later included some master's level students too. So, but that time also, I was looking at also opening a 1 day a week private practice in Mountain View on the peninsula. So I joined this sort of therapist boot camp, this online resource to learn how to open your own practice because I'd never done that. So on one of the phone calls that were national, probably 30, 40 other people on the call, the two leaders, or the two facilitators, were inviting everybody to consider what their niche was. What's your niche? How are you going to get your name out there? And so I was listening to people. And then I heard this one woman, and she said, "Oh, well, mine's IFS. That's all I do." And I thought, how can how can somebody only do something I've never even heard of? Okay, so then I immediately on that call got in and Googled IFS, and I'm now paying attention to what I'm seeing on my computer, and I'm reading just some core tenets of IFS. I thought, wait a minute, and I was getting chills, and I thought, this is remarkable. This is brilliant. And then I looked up upcoming workshops, and developer Dick Schwartz was going to be at Essel in January of 2016. I'd always wanted to go to Esalen, so I thought, perfect. And so I signed up, fortunately got in. And in January 2016, I'm at the Murphy House at Esalen and sitting in a group of 33 other people and Dick and two assistants. And for 5 days was immersed in IFS. And there literally was my life before IFS and after. I was so incredibly moved by what I experienced in the demos he did with people. So at the end, I said, this is the most powerful healing modality I've ever encountered. And I do this thing. I teach these students, and I'm new to it, and I'm new to IFS, but I'd like to introduce them to it. How would that feel to you if I did that? And he said, well, you're introducing it, so you'd be learning with the students. He said, let me know if I can help you with anything. And with that spirit of generosity, I sort of went back to the students and I said, I've just learned something new, and I'm going to bring it in for the remainder of our training, which ended in August. And they warmed to it immediately. And so then it became part of the process for the remaining 5 years that I was there in my directorship till I retired. And every year they got Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, and Intro to IFS to start their training. But most important to me was that they learn IFS for themselves. This wasn't learn this to take it to somebody. Learn it to see how it resonates, if it resonates with you. And if it does, then see if it fits bringing it to a client and see if it resonates for them. And we'll all learn together and let them know that. And so that's how we went forward. And it's been one of the most beautiful experiences of my life, and also one of the most challenging, because to support a student, if they aren't learning it in graduate school yet, then help them learn it in the practicum and internship, but they need to have a supervisor who knows it. And if they don't have a supervisor who knows it, they're not going to get the support they need to really bring the model in. And most therapists learn how to be therapists through two different means: their own therapy and their supervision in graduate school. Mm-hmm. And so this is really important. And it takes time to turn around an ocean liner on the ocean. And that's right now the field of psychology. It's turning slowly, but it's turning.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were talking about bringing the IFS model there to your, as you were new to the model, but learning alongside your students. Before we were talking, you were also talking about how you've realized within the decades of your clinical practice the importance of listening and learning from the people who are consulting your clients. Will you share a bit more about why that's been so important for you, and the importance of learning from our clients?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, if there were one word that I would offer as the most important word for all therapists, maybe just all people, but all therapists for sure, is to listen, to slow down and to really deeply listen. And that means not just with our ears, but with our hearts open. And to feel what another person is telling you, to be present with them. And of course, that means from an IFS perspective, you're working with your own system to recognize if a client, in the therapeutic context, if a client comes in and they're suffering terribly, and that activates a part of me that's not comfortable with that level of suffering, consciously or unconsciously, I'm going to shut them down. And how can I help facilitate a healing process if I'm now shutting them down? So first thing is, it always is going to start with me and how open I can be. And then when I can be there, and one of those C words is also courageous, and the core in courageous is heart. And so that's to sit with somebody and be present so that you can be in their pain with them and not overwhelmed by it and not afraid of it, but present with it so that you can just let them know, I can be here and meet you in this. And I want to get to know you. And I'd like to hear what it is that has brought you here and how it's impacting you. What's happening for you now? And so that listening is so important. And that took me many, many years to get. And the people who taught me were my clients. So I had some really wonderful professors, and I had a really exceptional supervisor who I'm still in touch with. He's 91, and we're still friends. But he was the one who had taught me, he didn't know IFS. We've since talked about it, but I was deeply psychoanalytically trained, and CBT and then DBT. What I learned from my supervisor, Meiji Singh, was when you meet a client and you're feeling your energy pulling away from them, do the exact opposite and just be present or even lean in a little bit. And when I just took that to heart, I recognized a shift in my energy and in the clients. And so that planted the seed for me. But after that, what I learned is all the techniques, all all of them, that I had learned could only get me so far. And I would hit stuck places with clients. And then I would start to get frustrated, nervous, anxious. They could feel it. I didn't know what to do. I thought it was my responsibility to somehow figure out what to do.
Mm,
And I didn't create space for them to just continue to be present and continue to share themselves with me. I got into problem solving. And so, uh, those clients, one by one, would let me know that that wasn't helpful one way or another. Maybe they'd say, "Well, maybe I should go. I think I'm getting tired," or whatever else, and so I just learned when I could sit and I could start to listen, and then IFS supported that completely. Um, time time runs out, and we're not done yet, and it has shifted everything. I've never once been stuck with IFS because I could layer it on to other modalities, but the more I did it, the more I ended up just really shifting purely over to IFS. But again, it's only been 7 years, and so I'm still new to it in some ways compared to other people. But what I learned is the more I can deeply listen to the clients and what's happening for them, and I can hold it, the more I'll connect to my capital S self. And in that space, it feels like the right questions arise or the right way to be present arises. And the clients feel it too. And something magical and synergistic comes from that. And maybe that's part of what we include as the healing.
mm. Wow. So I'm hearing a deep listening to the lived experience of the people across from you, but also it's a parallel process of listening to yourself in those areas where you as a clinician were stuck at times. The IFS model I'm hearing gave you a frame for listening to yourself and being with those parts of you that maybe wanted to problem solve. And
Mhm.
maybe you talking about grad programs, and I think in a lot of the models that we have are very intellectually focused, are very problem solving focused. And so the approach like IFS, I mean Rogerian therapy, it's
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
that deep listening and
Mhm.
how powerful that is. You were talking about when you first started learning about IFS at that workshop. You were moved, and I wanted to ask a bit more about that experience. Like, what was it that was really landing for you?
Mm.
What was that movement for you?
Yeah. You just brought me right back to that room. I remember where I was seated. Um, and it wasn't just me. There were many people where we would just have tears coming down, or again, repeated chills that would go up and down my body. It was, it was this. It would be watching Dick Schwartz sitting opposite somebody who volunteered to be in a demo. And regardless of what this person said or did, or regardless of any energy they brought in or the things they were revealing, Dick just sat with them. And it was tempting to watch the person in the client role, but I kept training my eyes back to Dick because I was noticing how little he said, how little he did, how he just sat very present with them and had this ability to ask certain questions that brought them into deeper and deeper awareness of what it was that was underneath the behaviors, the reactivity, the maybe automatic responses they'd had in their lives for which they were carrying great shame and guilt and remorse, things they'd said or done to other people. And how, regardless, whatever came up, he just sat and he'd say things like, "Okay, good. Okay, that's really good. Now stay with that part and just notice what else is it wanting you to get? And and now just check in and see, is that part getting that you get it? let it know. Yeah, you get it, and see if how it responds. I was watching this inner relationship, and I'd never been taught that. The other thing I noticed was, just as you said, we're taught from here to here in graduate school. There are some programs that have a somatic element, but it's really academic, it's theoretical, it's statistics, it's analyses, it's program design and research. From here down, this is where our wisdom is, because the body, as Bessel van der Kolk says, it keeps the score. It has phenomenal memory.
Yeah.
And what I was watching was when Dick would go with the person into deeper and deeper inquiry, and they would notice somewhere in their body that they felt a connection, like when they touched on something very deep and tender, they would, how often he'd say, "Where do you feel that now, in or around your body?" And they'd say, "My heart." Or talking about some sort of energetic, angry response or protective response. "Where are you feeling that now?" "Right here in my gut, and I feel it in my shoulders." And he'd say, "Okay, focus on that. Just stay with that and see what you're noticing now." I don't know, it's weird. I've got a memory of myself in second grade. I don't know why. It's all right. Maybe stay with that and just see what's there for you to get. I never knew in those demos. I'd think, "Oh, I think I know where we're gonna go," because I was analyzing, and then all of a sudden, we'd take a turn and go somewhere else, and where where the client was going when Dick would gently ask them, invite them to go deeper, was exactly the core of where the pain was, and you could map it out and see that manifestation is that behavior today. This is amazing. And so each time I would have one of those aha moments, I'd get the chills. And then sometimes, because people tapped into such beautiful, delicate, and tender parts of themselves and things they were experiencing as little kids, it would be very moving. Real tender responses would come out of me, and you could feel it in the room. You could just feel the container, and there was a lot of love and a lot of gratitude and a lot of tenderness.
Wow. Well, that's so beautiful. And I know for me personally, some of the more impactful moments in my life have been to witness someone else um, sh- share those honest, raw emotions that are there, and then yeah, get they're tied into a part, right, that's stuck in time, that needs their attention, and how powerful it is to have someone with that person who has the self energy, who can invite them into being with that part of them, and they
Right.
know that the therapist can't know what that
Mhm.
person needs. And you're saying, okay, I think I know what direction this is going. We don't, we can see like patterns like you're talking about, and like a
Mhm.
process. But at the same time, my one of my favorite professors in grad school, Dr. Vargas, he would say, therapies consists of hellos, goodbyes, and a whole lot of surprise. And that's
Mhm.
certainly true. It's in all our
That's
relationships
right.
in life, that
That's
surprise.
right.
But to hold that context where someone can love on that younger part of them that was maybe neglected, maybe abused, how touching and moving that has been for me to be come alongside and support people in that process, and then also for me to do that personally. It's some of the more meaningful work I think that we can do as therapists. I think like EMDR, for example, oftentimes that's what will happen, even if there isn't that
Mhm.
IFS framework. But
Mhm.
how powerful to be there in our body, and then
Mhm.
reparent those younger
Mhm.
parts of us that need that love.
Could I add something to that, Andrew?
Please.
So I imagine that if you were the client, there's a sort of a rule of IFS that you want to have more self in the room than the biggest part. And so that means me as a therapist, checking in with my parts. making sure that I'm accessing. I always just think critical mass, 51%.
Yeah.
Anything better and higher is just gravy, but there's that. And then what I'm doing is to help you unblend from your burdened parts that might be protective. It's what historically psychology calls resistant or defensive. IFS calls, protective. And protective parts blend. They might not know me, they don't trust me, but if I can earn their trust and then support you in connecting back with a part of you that maybe got hurt, maybe that little guy was 7, and you connecting and being shown a memory, and me saying to you, "All right, so you're seeing that 7-year-old Andrew? Okay. And are you getting what's happening to him in that scene? All right. You're seeing that? All right. Go ahead and bring yourself into that scene and just be with him in the way that he needed somebody back then." So there's no fixing that little boy. It's being with him
Yeah.
and then really getting what was happening. And all of us have thinking parts, especially if we spend a lot of time in graduate school where those get rewarded.
Yeah.
This is where those thinking parts didn't come online until we were probably in our mid to late 20s, based on a lot of the work that Dan Siegel's done about really the true length of our adolescence and the full integration of all elements of our brain and its functioning. Our thinking parts weren't there at that point. We didn't have that integrative capacity as little kids. So the thinking parts say things, we have to keep them back. If you've got a thinking part, Andrew, let's invite it to just step back. And I'm just going to invite you to be with that 7-year-old the way he needed it back then. When we can help that 7-year-old and even retrieve him from that scene so he can actually let go of the burdens he's been carrying, which is a part of the IFS process. And then we can finish the process and return back to the parts that have given space, those traditional parts, and invite the thinking part in and see how it is now that it's been witness to something it didn't know. Those parts will often say, "I didn't know. I didn't know." It's like, of course you didn't. How could you? How could you? But now you do, and now parts become more informed, and it also means in subsequent therapy sessions, your thinking parts are much more willing to step back because they've learned, if I step back, we get the information rather than me trying to figure out why I behave the way I do.
Yeah. It's a learning experience for those protectors. And I wanted to track back, you said when people are blended with the protectors, so the protectors are kind of the ones running the show. Maybe it's a protector that's critical of the
Yeah,
world, of others. Maybe it's
yeah,
one that's intellectualizing. Maybe it's one that is just in a place of hopelessness. Woe is me. Um, what does it, because I
yeah.
think that this is a point where a lot of therapists will get stuck is when so I'm hearing part of it is being in touch with our own system and having just at least 51% of
Mhm,
that self energy, of that leaning in
mhm,
when
mhm.
a part of us is triggered, by something that's happening. So I'm hearing that's a key part. What else does it take to build that trust with those
Mhm.
protective parts? Because I know, especially with the protective part that's just pointing the fingers at everyone else. This guy showed me this little meme. I thought it was pretty funny. It said, "Somebody's therapist knows everything about you." It's like, oh, that's an example of probably not the most effective therapy, right? But so how do we build trust with those parts while not letting them take
Yeah,
over and run the therapy sessions?
right, right. Um, s I would say the same thing is listen to them. So the first thing, there's another rule with IFS, and it's different than what I learned. What I learned is in therapy, go for the sort of cathartic expression. Go for the big energy movement and break through the resistance. And so uh, what I we do it differently with IFS. So really what we do is get to learn about what's going on in a person's life. What's happening for them? Where are they feeling stuck? And then listen, and they'll probably bring up 2 or 3 different things that are areas in their life where they're stuck. So then I can ask, "Okay, of those, is there one you'd like to begin with? Just one you'd like to begin with?" Now, sometimes people come to me because they know I do IFS specifically, and that's true actually most of the time now. But in the early days, people didn't know. I didn't sell them on the model. I sometimes wouldn't even use any of the language of self or parts, but it's so common that people will say, "Well, a part of me." And so the moment they do that, then I can say, "Okay, so what I hear is a part of you is feeling really hopeless." Um, and it sounds like then there's another part that's trying all these things, including therapy, to figure out how you can feel more hopeful again in your life. Is that right? Okay. Would you want to start there? And then they might start to cry and say, "Yes, I recognize in IFS that's the tender part. That's the one that we call the exiled part. That's the one whose emotions are usually so big and so hurt that we have two primary types of response, two protective responses. One is manage it. Manage it. Become a perfectionist. Become a person who senses into what others need of you and figure out how to do it. Become that person who's really, determined and is gonna make it at all costs, no matter what. And you're that becomes a primary protector, and we've all got them, and that's kind of who runs our lives most of the time. And but like trying to keep a cork underwater, sometimes that emotion will come back out again. And it most often happens with our primary relationships or our family of origin members,
Yeah.
especially around the holidays.
Yeah.
So, oh, whoops, all the emotions, they're now coming, and I'm starting to feel flooded, and that managing protector can't keep it down. Out comes what we call the firefighter in IFS, because it's just like firefighters at the station. They're there waiting for the alarm. They're there waiting for the smoke, and where there's smoke, there's fire. They get there, they go in. They might knock down your door, spray your beautiful Turkish rugs, it doesn't matter. They don't care about collateral damage. They need to get the fire out. And in IFS, it's the emotional fire. And all of us know that that's when we're actually feeling the most embarrassed or ashamed, because we'll have a really eruptive reactive response. And then later come back and feel contrition and regret. That's kind of the manager coming back online. I can't, there's often a polarization, tension between these two. I'm trying to manage because I never want this part of me that's tender and vulnerable to get hurt again, and I also don't want it to leak out, because when it leaks out, the whole system kind of falls apart. All right. So I think I might need to come back into my lane again, because that was such an elaborate sort of description of what happens in the system with IFS. Um, where was it? Yeah, I think I derailed for a
Well,
moment. Or
I'm there with you. I think that was such a great description of the protectors, the managers, and the firefighters, and their how they even relate to each other. And then I was also thinking of like how external systems as well as other people then impact those parts of us. I mean, like a lot of firefighters in our society, like especially addictive parts or parts that are really reactive emotionally. There's just not much acceptance of them. There's a lot of criticism towards those parts. And yeah, I've heard Dick talk about like when someone relapses, who's seeing him, he'll say something to the effect of good, like
yeah,
now we have this access to this part of you
right,
that needs to be listened
right.
to.
Right, because the managing part had been suppressing it for so long that now we have access to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And do you find addictive tendencies are generally a firefighter
Mhm,
role, a manager role,
mhm.
or
Yeah,
both?
yeah. Yeah, no, the addictive, the, the binging, the addictive, the anything that's the attempt to put out the emotional fire at all costs without concern for collateral damage. The DSM is full of firefighters. And also some of the more rigid managed parts are also in the DSM. It's desperate need to do whatever the system needs to not be overwhelmed by the part that's holding the injury, the emotional injury in the wound. So think about trauma and how this is writ large with people who've had complex trauma, developmental trauma. There are so many wounded parts and so many protective parts that, thank goodness, the ACE study came out, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, to show the correlation between childhood, adverse experiences and the physical manifestation of illness, as well as addictions, incarceration, homelessness, and even higher likelihood of psychoses.
Mm-hmm. And for those who are listening who maybe are not familiar with the adverse childhood experience, also called ACE, it's a 10 question uh,
Mhm.
questionnaire, and there's been a ton of research on one score and then correlations with mental health problems and physical health issues and socioeconomic status. I mean, the higher that score is, the more predictive of it is of those the IFS frame, those strong protectors developing
Right,
and yeah, serious problems in people's lives.
right. And they're not that I really wanna underscore this for your listeners. I was trained that, diagnoses like borderline personality disorder or bipolar 1 disorder was lifelong. There was no changing it. There was only adapting to it. That is not true. That is not true. And I know if I have clients diagnosed with that who hear your podcast, they will know that it's not true. And one in particular is no longer able to be diagnosed by her prescribing physician for either of those diagnoses, which she carried her whole life from the age of 19 on through to the end of her 50s. 4 days a week therapy for 7 years and institutionalization as a young woman. So I was not taught this, but I've seen it, and this is gonna be a bridge over to possibly, if you're open to it, some talk about psychedelics and
Mm-hmm.
IFS,
Absolutely.
because the work with her started in 2016, and in 2018, I worked with a prescriber in the Bay Area who would prescribe her ketamine for her depression as we were looking at a way to titrate down some of the lifetime use of antidepressants, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, uh, anxiolytics. So, ketamine ended up becoming a beautiful medicine for her to use. And we created an at home protocol that she now recognizes has shifted her life. And what it did was it accelerated the work. It didn't replace the IFS. IFS, as you described earlier, was a way to contextualize. It's an elegant language for what exists that we now have words to apply to this bigger experience of the dynamic systems we all have. Bring in psychedelics like ketamine at a high enough dosage or non-psychedelic for at-home protocol, and couple that with IFS therapy, it tends to be the perfect marriage.
Wow. And I'm just filled with hope, and that I think that's the IFS effect it has is it provides such hope because I got into narrative therapy in my graduate studies, and a big piece that attracted me to narrative was how it wasn't pathologizing, right? It was
Right.
this response to these systems that like in these ways of thinking that can perpetuate problems and really keep people stuck, and I think that there's definitely a place for diagnoses. I don't like the language disease or disorders that's often associated with a lot of these, as you know, we're talking about their
Mhm.
protective parts, right? And
Mhm.
I get really hopeful when I hear about the effects of psychedelic therapies, of ketamine, psilocybin.
Mhm.
Really hopeful when I hear about the work at IFS, where this person can't even be, you know, labeled as having this disorder anymore by you know, an outsider who's an expert in labeling
Mhm.
people.
Mhm.
So I love that shift away from pathology and all of the possibility that's there for healing within this model, psychedelics. Also, for me too, I've experienced it with nutrition, and
Mhm.
Dr. Chris Palmer is a psychiatrist who's really bringing the work of the ketogenic diet into
Mhm.
the profound effect it can have on different like psychotic disorders and problems people face. So I get hopeful with these conversations.
Yeah, at this point in my career, as I'm sort of winding down, I see myself doing less clinical work and more supervision, consultation, training, especially for future psychedelic-assisted therapists, because there's gonna be a big need for them, especially after MDMA gets rescheduled, which hopefully will be 2023. And the great good fortune of being an Oregonian and also a Coloradan, since they passed similar measures, is that there's going to be an opportunity to work with these psychedelic medicines and to identify ideal therapies, ideal modalities, ideal languages that we can bring in so we can have a common language to be able to describe and for people to describe what their experience is, because I was always doing people's treatment plans, um, and describing how they were having success. I needed to show success. It was actually irrelevant. It was completely invalid. It just was. But it was part of what I needed to do. Why was it invalid? Because I wasn't asking them, can you tell me what you're noticing that's different, that is feeling better to you? There wasn't a place in my forms to be able to do that. It was more about my assessment because I was entrusted as the expert. I knew better than them. I didn't I didn't perceive they had an inner healing intelligence, but they do. We do. So now we listen, we ask, and people tell us.
Well,
Yeah.
Dr. Morgan, I could talk to you the rest of the day. I think this is so engaging for me. Before I ask you the last question I have to pose on these interviews, could you let the listeners know where they can find your work, how they could get in touch with what you do?
Mm. Yes. My website is The Guide Inside, all one word. That's self. TheGuideInside.com. And that's where you can find me, and my contact information is there. A lot of things that I've written. In fact, coming out in March, there's going to be a book. It's actually, I think, about 33 chapters, and it's all on integrating IFS into things like, for instance, somatic experiencing, Hakomi, um, uh, the Enneagram, people who use the Enneagram, and then any number of therapeutic modalities. And mine is on integrating IFS and psychedelics, my chapter. So
Great.
that'll be coming out in March. That's not on the website yet. March or thereabouts. But other articles like IFS for each stage of the psychedelic experience is an article that I published with two colleagues in the Netherlands. So if people are interested in IFS or IFS and psychedelics, they can find it on that website.
Perfect, and I'll link that in the show notes. And then the question I like to pose at the end is you've given a lot of these messages already, but what's a message of hope that you want to leave the listeners with?
Hmm. The message of hope. Um, hmm. Uh, okay, it's a big question because right now in my entire career, I am more hopeful now than I ever have been. And so I have to think, okay, what shifted in me? One, access to a really elegant language and a beautiful modality that's focused on healing. and the hope that the psychedelic, especially the plant medicines, are providing right now for so many people who have been suffering for so long and have their own testimonials about their ability to begin to have hope and to begin to believe healing is possible.
Well, that's beautiful. And thank you so much for taking the time, Dr. Morgan. I hope you'll come back at some point. I'd love to talk more about your research and practice with the psychedelic-assisted therapy. And but yeah, thanks again for taking the time.
Thank you. And congratulations to you for getting through graduate school and then starting a podcast. That's pretty ambitious, and I'm so appreciative. Thank you, Andrew.
Please press the subscribe button, as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you.